It is 6:30 in the morning. The sun is just coming up, that soft golden light that makes everything look peaceful and clean and like the world is a fundamentally decent place. I am standing in my backyard in my pajamas, coffee in one hand, and I am staring at my peach tree. Or rather, I am staring at what used to be my peach tree. 3 weeks ago, that tree had 47 peaches on it. I counted them. I know that sounds obsessive, but when you have spent 3 years nursing a peach tree from a scraggly sapling into something that actually produces fruit, you count. You check on them the way you check on something you love. You watch them go from hard little green pellets to the first blush of pink to the deep amber gold that means they are ready. 47 peaches, ready, perfect, 3 years of work. This morning, there are four peaches on a tree that had 47 peaches yesterday evening when I went to bed. Not fallen, not bird-pecked, not damaged by anything natural. Gone. Cleanly, deliberately, thoroughly gone, the stems still attached to the branches, the fruit simply absent, as if someone had come in the night and collected every one of them with a patience and thoroughness that honestly I have to admire even as it makes my blood boil. I stood there with my coffee and I looked at my 4 remaining peaches and I thought about my neighbor Gary. And then I had an idea. The most beautiful, most patient, most perfectly constructed idea I have ever had in my life. It involved peppers, specifically the hottest peppers on the face of the earth, and it involved waiting, and it involved the precise moment when Gary reached into what he thought was my fruit garden and grabbed something he was absolutely, catastrophically not prepared for. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning. The story begins. My name is Ellen Parsons, and I have lived at 6 Sycamore Court in the Willowbrook Estates HOA community for 6 years. I am a retired biology teacher, 31 years in the classroom, and yes, what I am about to tell you absolutely involves things I learned in those 31 years, and yes, I am extremely proud of that. My backyard is my retirement project. When I left teaching, I made myself a promise. I was going to grow things, real things, a proper kitchen garden, tomatoes, beans, herbs, squash, and fruit trees. I had always wanted fruit trees. There is something about a fruit tree that a vegetable garden cannot give you, a kind of permanence, a sense that you have put something in the ground that will outlast the season and come back next year and the year after. I planted a peach tree, a plum tree, and 2 apple trees in my first spring at Willowbrook. The apples took well immediately. The plum tree is still somewhat uncertain about its purpose in life, but the peach tree was my pride. Peaches are not easy. They need specific conditions, careful pruning, attention to pests and disease. I read 3 books about peach cultivation before I planted mine. I barbied that tree through 2 bad winters and 1 terrible summer when the aphids found it, and I thought I was going to lose it entirely. By year 3, it rewarded me with 47 peaches. My neighbor Gary Hutchins lives at 8 Sycamore Court, directly to my right. His backyard shares a fence line with mine, a standard 6-foot wood privacy fence that the HOA requires for all backyard boundaries. The fence runs along the full length of the property line, which means Gary's yard and my yard are separated by 6 feet of wood and approximately 0 goodwill, at least on my side. Gary is 51 years old, heavyset, loud in the particular way that some men are loud, not shouting exactly, just existing at a volume slightly above what the situation requires. He works in some kind of contracting business that involves his truck being loaded and unloaded at irregular hours. He has a riding lawnmower that he uses on a lawn approximately the size of a dining room table, which I find baffling. He grills constantly, from April through October, always with the particular smoke direction that suggests his grill was engineered specifically to maximize airflow toward my yard. I have never liked Gary. This is not a judgment I make lightly. I spent 31 years being professionally patient with teenagers, which means my threshold for adult irritation is extremely high. Gary clears it consistently. The first theft, and I am going to use that word, because that is what it was, happened in my second summer at Willowbrook. I had a bed of strawberries along the back fence, running parallel to the property line. One morning I went out to pick strawberries and there were very few left, and I could see from the fence that someone had leaned over from Gary's side. The fence is 6 feet, but Gary is tall and presumably owns a step stool and picked most of them from above. I told myself it was probably a coincidence. Maybe birds, maybe neighborhood children, maybe something I couldn't see. I replanted the strawberry bed further from the fence and said nothing. The following summer, my tomatoes, a whole section of cherry tomatoes that I had grown from seed, heavy and perfect and ready to pick. I went out one morning and a large portion of them were gone, not all, but enough. Clean stems where fruit had been. No mess, no fallen tomatoes, no sign of animal involvement. I moved the tomatoes further from the fence. Year 4, my apple trees produced their first real crop. Not many apples, maybe 20 on one tree and 15 on the other, but actual, beautiful, edible apples. I watched them carefully. I picked them the moment they were ready. I thought I had outpaced Gary. I thought the distance from the fence had solved the problem. Then came year 5 and the 47 peaches. My peach tree is in the corner of my yard furthest from the house, but closest to the fence line on Gary's side. I had not moved it because the tree was established, and moving an established fruit tree is complicated and stressful for the plant. I had told myself that by the time the tree was producing real fruit, I would figure out a solution. I had not figured out a solution, and now I had 4 peaches instead of 47. I stood at my kitchen window that morning, and I watched Gary come out his back door and fire up his grill, and I felt something that I can only describe as the specific, cold, clear anger of a woman who has been patient for 5 years and has reached the end of her patience with mathematical precision. I went inside and I made a list. The list had 2 sections. Section 1, evidence collection. Section 2, solution. Evidence collection. I am a retired biology teacher. I know what careful observation looks like. I know what systematic documentation looks like. And I know that before you take any action, you establish that your hypothesis is correct. My hypothesis: Gary Hutchins had been harvesting my fruit over the fence for years, and the 47 peaches had been taken by Gary on the night of July 14th. I needed evidence. I bought a trail camera, the kind hunters use, that takes photos automatically when triggered by motion. I mounted it on the back fence post at an angle that covered the peach tree and the fence line. It cost me $62. I considered it an investment. I also talked to my neighbor on the other side, a woman named Frances Odom, who is 81 years old, sharp as a tack, and has the particular observational powers of someone who has lived in a neighborhood long enough to notice everything. Frances has a kitchen window that looks directly over our shared fence into my yard, from a slight elevation because her lot is graded higher than mine. I knocked on Frances' door and I said, "Frances, can I ask you something?" She said, "Ask." I said, "Have you ever seen Gary Hutchins in my yard or near my fence line?" Frances said, "Not in your yard, over your fence, several times." I said, "Over my fence how?" She said, "He has one of those lightweight aluminum step ladders. He sets it up against his side of the fence, steps up, reaches over. He did it with your strawberries. He did it with your tomatoes. And I saw him do it twice with those peaches." She paused. She said, "I should have told you sooner. I'm sorry, Ellen. I thought he must have some arrangement with you." I said, "There is no arrangement." She said, "I see." She said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I'm going to be very patient and very deliberate." She said, "Good, that's usually best." 3 weeks after mounting the trail camera, I had photographs. Clear, time-stamped photographs of Gary Hutchins on a stepladder leaning over my fence at 11:20 p.m. on a Tuesday night, harvesting peaches from my tree with a grocery bag. I sat at my kitchen table and looked at those photographs for a long time. Then I pulled up my browser and I typed, "Hottest peppers in the world." The pepper plan. Carolina Reaper, developed by a breeder named Ed Curlin in South Carolina, certified by Guinness World Records as the hottest pepper on Earth. Scoville heat units, approximately 2.2 million. For context, a jalapeno runs between 2,000 and 8,000 Scoville units. A habanero, which most people consider seriously hot, tops out around 350,000. The Carolina Reaper is roughly 6 times hotter than a habanero. People who eat them on camera for entertainment generally spend the following 20 to 40 minutes in visible agony. They are red, deeply, richly, beautifully red when ripe. They are roughly the size and shape of a cherry tomato, perhaps slightly smaller. They have a characteristic wrinkled, bumpy skin and a distinctive little pointed tail at the bottom. They look, from a distance, extremely similar to cherry tomatoes. I ordered seeds online that evening. Now I want to be very clear about something, because it matters both legally and morally. Carolina Reapers are not poisonous. They are not dangerous in the way that something actually toxic is dangerous. Eating one is an extremely unpleasant experience. There will be intense burning, sweating, potential nausea, what pepper enthusiasts call the hiccups, which are more like full-body spasms, and general misery lasting anywhere from 20 minutes to an hour. But it is not medically harmful to a healthy adult, and Gary Hutchins, based on my observations, is a healthy adult who eats extremely large quantities of grilled meat with no apparent consequences. I was not poisoning anyone. I was growing legal peppers on my property and letting nature take its course. The seeds arrived in 8 days. I started them indoors under grow lights. Carolina Reapers need a long growing season and warm temperatures, so starting them early is essential. I cleared a portion of my indoor seedling shelf that I normally use for tomato starts, and I devoted it entirely to the peppers. I told no one except Frances. Frances, when I explained the plan over tea one afternoon, looked at me for a long moment and then said, "Ellen, that is the most elegant thing I have ever heard." I said, "Thank you." She said, "Can I watch when it happens?" I said, "I will position a lawn chair." The garden redesign. Here is the part that required the most patience, and patience is something I have in abundance. I redesigned the corner of my garden closest to Gary's fence. Out came the struggling basil and the crowded marigolds. I built 2 new raised beds in that corner, cedar planks, properly constructed, visually attractive. I planted tomatoes in the bed closer to the house. In the bed closest to the fence, the one most accessible from Gary's stepladder, I planted the Carolina Reapers. I planted them in among a few actual cherry tomato plants, the same variety I usually grow, so the overall visual profile of the bed looked completely normal. Green plants, red fruits of similar size and shape. The Reapers grew. They are vigorous plants once established. By midsummer, they were lush and productive, covered in fruits that cycled from green to yellow to orange to the deep, glossy red of full ripeness. I tended them carefully. I watered them, fertilized them, checked them for pests. I harvested my cherry tomatoes regularly so the bed stayed looking abundant and appealing. I left the Carolina Reapers on the vine. I did nothing to mark them. I did nothing to label them. They were in my garden, on my property, entirely legal, entirely mine. I remounted the trail camera. I went about my life. And then came the evening of August 9th. The evening of August 9th. I was inside watching television at approximately 9:15 p.m. when the trail camera notification came through to my phone. I had set it to send an alert when triggered. I looked at the notification, motion detected. I put down my remote control. I went to the kitchen window. I could see, in the low light of the summer evening, Gary Hutchins on his stepladder, leaning over my fence, reaching into the raised bed closest to the fence line. I watched him select several fruits. From this distance and in this light, they looked red and small and round, exactly like cherry tomatoes. He descended his ladder. He went inside. I sat down. I waited. 14 minutes later, I know because I was watching the clock, I heard it. A sound from Gary's yard that I can only describe as involuntary. Not a scream exactly, more of a surprised, escalating vocalization that started as a sharp exhale and built into something that might generously be called an extended expression of distress. Then I heard his back door open. Then his garden hose, he turned it on, and I could hear the water running, which suggested he was trying to cool his mouth. This does not work with capsaicin, which is oil-based and not water-soluble, but Gary did not know that. The hose ran for several minutes. Then there was a period of what I can only describe as active suffering, audible through the fence, of the kind that confirmed Gary had eaten at least one and possibly more of my Carolina Reapers under the impression that they were cherry tomatoes. Frances texted me from next door, "Is that Gary?" I texted back, "Yes." She texted, "Outstanding." I went to bed at my normal time. I slept very well. In the morning, I went out to my garden and I tended my plants and I had coffee in the sunshine and I felt, for the first time in 6 years of living next to Gary Hutchins, something very close to complete peace. But the story does not end there. Because Gary, rather than reflecting quietly on what had happened and perhaps reconsidering his relationship with other people's gardens, decided to escalate. And escalating to someone who has been patiently planning for a year is almost always a mistake. What Gary did next, what the HOA got involved with, what Frances did at the community meeting, and the moment when Gary finally understood exactly what had happened and why, all of that is in part 2. Quick version, I'm Ellen Parsons, retired biology teacher. My neighbor Gary Hutchins had been stealing fruit from my garden for 5 years, strawberries, tomatoes, 47 peaches taken in one night. I got trail camera evidence. I researched the hottest pepper on earth, the Carolina Reaper, 2.2 million Scoville units, looks exactly like a cherry tomato when ripe. I grew them in the bed closest to Gary's fence, mixed in with real tomatoes. Gary came over the fence on the evening of August 9th and helped himself. 14 minutes later, I heard the consequences through the fence. It was, I will say, one of the most satisfying 14-minute waits of my life. But Gary didn't learn, he escalated. I want to give Gary some credit here. He is not a man without resources. He is, in his way, a problem solver. The problem for Gary was that he had eaten something from what he believed to be my garden and experienced approximately 40 minutes of significant oral distress, and he needed someone to blame for this, and he was not prepared to blame himself because that would require acknowledging that he had been in my garden without my permission. So Gary told a story. The story was this. He had been walking along the fence line in his own yard and noticed some red fruits growing near the fence, and believing them to be on the shared boundary, had picked a few. And these fruits had burned his mouth severely, and clearly I had grown something dangerous and toxic in my garden, and this was a community safety issue. I know this is the story Gary told because 2 days after the August 9th incident, I received a phone call from the Willowbrook Estates HOA board vice president, a man named Ted Blalock, who said, "Ellen, we've received a complaint from your neighbor Gary Hutchins about a potentially toxic plant growing in your garden." I said, "Ted, what exactly is the complaint?" Ted said, "Gary says he accidentally ate some fruit from near your fence line and became seriously ill. He's asking the board to investigate what you're growing." I said, "Ted, I am a retired biology teacher. I grow vegetables and fruit in my backyard. None of them are toxic." Ted said, "What about the red fruits near the fence?" Gary described them as. I said, "Carolina Reaper peppers. They are legal to grow. They are available at garden centers. They are not toxic. They are, however, extremely hot, and eating one without knowing what you are eating is an unpleasant experience." Silence. Ted said, "Gary says he picked them thinking they were on the boundary or in a common area." I said, "Ted, I have a property survey, a trail camera with time-stamped photographs, and a neighbor witness. My plants are entirely within my property line." Gary accessed them by climbing a stepladder and reaching over my 6-foot privacy fence. I have this on camera. A longer silence. Ted said, "You have it on camera." I said, "I have been having fruit stolen from my garden for 5 years, Ted. I mounted a trail camera. I have Gary Hutchins on video at 11:20 p.m. harvesting peaches from my peach tree over the fence. I also have him on camera on August 9th, collecting what appear to be fruits from my raised bed, again over the fence, again without my permission." Ted said, "Ellen, oh." I said, "I'm happy to share the footage with the board at your next meeting. I think it will be clarifying." Ted said, "Yes, I think it will." He paused. He said, "I have to ask, did you grow those peppers specifically near that fence because of the theft situation?" I said, "Ted, I grow what I choose to grow in my garden. I have a particular interest in unusual pepper varieties. Carolina Reapers are a legitimate horticultural achievement, and I find them fascinating from a botanical standpoint." He said, "That's not exactly an answer." I said, "No, it's not." He was quiet for a moment. Then he made a sound that might, if you were being generous, be described as a suppressed laugh. He said, "I'll see you at the meeting." The HOA meeting. The monthly HOA meeting was 3 weeks later. I arrived early. Frances came with me. She had printed on her home printer a photograph of a Carolina Reaper pepper with the Scoville rating printed underneath, which she intended to use as a visual aid if the situation called for it. I told her that was possibly unnecessary. She said she would keep it in her purse just in case. The meeting room was reasonably full, about 20 residents. Gary was there, in the back row, with the particular posture of a man who has convinced himself he is the wronged party and is ready to present his case. Ted Blalock opened the meeting and moved through routine business. Then he said, "We have a resident matter to address." A complaint was filed by Gary Hutchins regarding garden plantings at 6 Sycamore Court. Gary straightened up. Ted said, "Gary, you want to summarize your concern?" Gary stood. He said, and I want to relay this as accurately as possible, he said that he had been walking near the fence line in his yard and had noticed what appeared to be cherry tomatoes growing near the fence, and that he had picked a few, believing them to be accessible from the boundary area. He said that eating these fruits had caused a severe reaction and that he believed I was growing something dangerous. He sat down. Ted said, "Ellen, your response." I stood. I said, "I appreciate the opportunity to respond. I want to address 3 things. First, the plants. Carolina Reaper peppers are a legitimate pepper variety certified by Guinness as the world's hottest and are widely available for home cultivation. They are not toxic. They are not dangerous. They are, however, significantly spicier than most people expect, particularly if eaten without knowing what they are. Second, the plant's location. My garden is entirely within my property line, which I can demonstrate with a property survey. Nothing I grow is in a common area or on the boundary. My plants are mine, on my property, end of story. Third, how Gary came to eat my peppers. I reached into my bag and I plugged a USB drive into the laptop Ted had set up on the table. I brought up the trail camera footage. I showed them Gary at 11:20 p.m. on a stepladder reaching over my 6-foot privacy fence, harvesting peaches from my tree with a grocery bag. Time stamped, clear as a photograph. I showed them Gary on August 9th at 9:19 p.m. on the same stepladder reaching over the same fence, selecting fruits from my raised bed. The room was very quiet. I said I have been growing a kitchen garden in my backyard for 6 years. Over those 6 years, I have lost strawberries, tomatoes, an apple harvest, and 47 peaches to what I can now demonstrate, on camera, is my neighbor Gary climbing a stepladder and reaching over my fence to help himself to my plants. I said I did not invite Gary into my garden. I did not give him permission to take my produce. He accessed my private property without authorization, repeatedly, over multiple years. When he did it most recently, he collected what he believed to be cherry tomatoes, which were in fact Carolina Reaper peppers that I was growing in that bed. His discomfort was the direct result of his own unauthorized access to my property. I paused. I said, I have also shared this footage with the county sheriff's non-emergency line, as repeated theft from a residential garden is a civil and potentially criminal matter. I sat down. Frances, next to me, straightened up with the particular satisfaction of a woman who has been waiting 3 weeks for this moment. The room was very, very quiet. Gary said, "Those peppers were a trap." I said, "Gary, a trap implies I placed something designed to harm you. Peppers growing in a garden are not a trap. The fact that you couldn't tell the difference between cherry tomatoes and Carolina Reapers might suggest that harvesting other people's plants without their knowledge is not a skill you have refined." Someone in the third row made a sound. It was laughter, quickly stifled, but laughter. Ted Blalock cleared his throat. He said, "Gary, I want to be direct with you. The footage Ellen has shared shows you accessing her private property without authorization on multiple occasions. That is a serious matter regardless of what plants are in her garden." Gary said, "The fence is." Ted said, 6 feet of private boundary, Gary. Ellen owns everything on her side." Gary looked at the table. Ted said, "Ellen, what outcome are you looking for from the board?" I said, "I want a formal HOA notice to Gary acknowledging that accessing another resident's private garden over a shared fence constitutes trespass and is a violation of Section 8 of the CC and RS regarding property boundaries and neighbor relations. I want that notice to include a warning that future incidents will result in fines and referral to the appropriate authorities." Ted looked at the other board members. They nodded one by one. Ted said, "The board agrees. Gary, you'll receive written notice within the week." Gary stood up. He looked at me. He said with some heat, "You planned this." I said, "I grew peppers in my garden, Gary." He said, "You put them there for me." I said, "I put them there for my garden. What you do in your own yard is your business. What you do in my garden, over my fence, without my permission, is very much the board's business, apparently." He walked out. Frances, beside me, opened her purse and looked at the printed Carolina Reaper photograph. She considered it for a moment, then put it back. She said quietly, "Saved for another day." What Gary did next. I want to tell you that Gary reflected on his behavior and became a better neighbor. I want to tell you that. What Gary actually did was go home, get on his computer, and post about the situation on the neighborhood's social media group, the community Facebook page that approximately half of Willowbrook Estates uses to share lost pet notices and road work updates and occasional heated debates about leaf blowers. His post said, and I am paraphrasing because the post has since been deleted, that a neighbor had grown toxic plants near their fence specifically to harm him, and that he had been made ill by these plants, and that the HOA had sided with the neighbor without a proper investigation. The post received 41 comments. I want to walk you through the arc of those comments because it is informative. The first several comments were sympathetic to Gary in a general way, people expressing concern, asking if he was okay, wondering what had happened. Normal community response. Then Frances commented. Frances' comment was 9 sentences long and included the Scoville rating of a Carolina Reaper, a brief explanation of capsaicin chemistry, a statement that she had personally witnessed Gary on a stepladder at Ellen's fence on at least 3 separate occasions over the past 4 years, and a gentle suggestion that Gary might want to reflect on the circumstances that led to his pepper encounter before characterizing it as someone else's fault. The comments shifted. Several people asked Gary directly, "Were you in Ellen's garden without permission?" Gary's response to this question was to not respond, which was its own kind of response. More people commented. A woman named Darlene, who lives 4 streets over, said she had also had fruit go missing from her garden over the past 3 summers and had always blamed birds. She tagged Gary in this comment. Gary did not respond to that either. A man named Robert said he had a garden on the side of his house that backs up to the path Gary uses when he walks his dog, and that he had noticed fruit missing from his plum tree twice. Gary still did not respond. The post was deleted by Gary approximately 18 hours after he posted it. By that point, it had generated 73 comments and what I can only describe as a significant community conversation about garden theft that Gary had not intended to initiate. I posted nothing, I simply let the conversation happen. Francis, however, posted one final comment before the post was deleted. It said, "Carolina Reapers are available at most garden centers and are a delight to grow. I highly recommend them." 14 people liked that comment. The formal notice and after. Gary received his formal HOA notice the following Wednesday. It cited Section 8, Clause D of the Willowbrook Estates CC and RS, the provision regarding respect for neighboring private property, and formally documented the board's finding that he had accessed a neighboring property without authorization on multiple occasions. It warned that future violations would result in fines and potential referral to civil authorities. He did not appeal the notice. I know he received it because his behavior changed immediately and completely. The stepladder disappeared from its spot along his fence line. I could see the top of it from my yard when it was there, and it was gone within 24 hours of the notice being delivered. More significantly, that fall, Gary knocked on my front door. I opened the door. He looked at me with the expression of a man who has thought about something for a long time and has arrived somewhere he did not expect to arrive. He said, "How many years did I take from your garden?" I said, "I know of incidents going back to year 2, so 4 years." He said, "The peaches." I said, 47 peaches, 3 years of work." He said, "I'm sorry." He said it the way people say it when they mean it, not the quick, reflexive apology that is really just social management, but the kind that has some weight behind it, some actual reckoning. I looked at him. I said, "Gary, you ate fruit out of my garden for 4 years without once thinking about what it cost me to grow it. Not just in money, in time, in care, in the particular investment you make in a living thing that you are trying to help survive. Do you understand that?" He said, "I think I understand it better now than I did before." I said, "The peppers helped with that understanding." He said, "They did, yeah." A pause. He said, "I didn't know they were peppers. I genuinely thought they were tomatoes." I said, "I know." He said, "Did you know I would mistake them?" I said, "I grew them in a bed where you had been helping yourself to tomatoes for years. I thought there was a reasonable chance." He said, "That's pretty calculated." I said, "Gary, I have a degree in biology, 31 years of teaching science, and 4 years of being robbed from. I am capable of a certain level of calculation." He looked at me for a long moment, then he said something that surprised me. He said, "My mother had a garden when I was a kid. She grew tomatoes and peppers and cucumbers, and she used to send me out to pick things for dinner." He paused. "I don't know why I thought it was okay to just take from yours. I think I just didn't think about whose it was." I said, "That's honest." He said, "I'm going to plant something in my own yard. I don't know what, but something." I said, "I can help you with that if you want. I know a fair amount about growing things." He looked surprised. He said, "Yeah." I said, "Come over some Saturday and we'll talk about what your yard can support. Your light situation is different from mine." He said, "Okay." He went home. I stood at my door for a moment after he left, in the afternoon light, feeling something I had not expected to feel. Not triumph exactly, and not forgiveness exactly, but something that might be the beginning of both, mixed together in the particular way that complicated human situations tend to mix things. Where we are now. The Carolina Reapers came back this year. They are perennial in our climate, or close enough, and the plants from last year overwintered in pots in my garage and are now in their second season, larger and more productive than ever. I have harvested a significant quantity of peppers, and have given jars of homemade hot sauce to Francis, to Ted Blalock, and to several other neighbors who expressed interest. I clearly labeled every jar, Carolina Reaper, handle with care, not a tomato. Gary started a container garden on his back patio last spring. He asked for my advice on tomatoes, which I gave freely. His tomatoes are mediocre, he is overwatering them, which I have told him twice, but they are his, and he is proud of them, and he has not touched mine. He knocked on my door in July with a paper bag. Inside the bag were 6 tomatoes, his own tomatoes, red and slightly uneven, the particular beauty of a homegrown thing. He said, "First real harvest, wanted to share." I took the tomatoes. I said, "These are good, Gary." He grinned. The peach tree had 39 peaches this year, fewer than the infamous 47, but still a real harvest, all of which I picked myself, at my own convenience, without finding them gone in the morning. I made 2 pies and a batch of preserves and gave a pie to Frances, who said it was the best thing she had eaten in years. I think she was right. 39 peaches, all mine. After 6 years and a great deal of patience and approximately 2 million Scoville units of karma. I will take it. The trail camera is still mounted on the fence, not because I expect trouble, just because I am a biology teacher and a biology teacher always documents.